Thank you. And my name is Greg Shnirring, and I have the honor of interviewing Ted Krichels today. And Ted, welcome.
Welcome, and I'm very happy to be here. I think I'll tell you when we're done.
So, Ted, why don't we start with your personal journey, because you've had a fascinating personal journey that I think probably influenced your professional career. But can you talk a little bit about that personal journey, because I think it's unique.
Uh, well, sure. And let me just jump into it. It's hard to know where to start. I grew up in a large family in the Berkshires. There were six children. Our father died when we were fairly young. I was 14. So we were to some degree on our own after that point. Our mother had a hard time uh, after her husband's death. So I didn't have a lot of direction. I went to a Catholic boarding school, all boys, which was an interesting experience. Then I went to an Ivy League college. This was during the 60s, and a lot of stuff was going on. Vietnam War, obviously, drugs, everything. And I originally, I think, was expected to be the lawyer in the family. But somehow, I mean, it might have been during my Russian literature phase. It didn't make sense to me that I would go to law school. And I was going to take the, what do they call it, PSAs, but I never did. Instead, I traveled around the country. I actually spent a couple of years. I went around the country 3 different times. In that process, especially around the third trip, I was intentionally doing different kind of psychology, spiritual workshops, so Gestalt, Encounter. There was one in San Francisco that was like 60-day Eureka enlightenment training. So at the end of it, I was enlightened for about 2 hours. And then I went to Maine. I had family, and a lot of us had gone up to Maine and bought some land. It was very cheap at that point in time. And I had made a commitment with a brother and a sister to build a house. So we met in Maine and built a house where I lived for a year or so. And it was a great experience. Very different than all my spiritual and all of that. I was very kind of, if you've ever been in rural Maine, it is not exactly San Francisco, or it's not. It's very, very different experience. So I was there, and then wanted to get back into some kind of spirituality, and had heard about Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which was a new kind of Buddhist college, and particularly brought in a lot of Western psychologists. So there were summer sessions that were really kind of interesting sessions where you had, different experts from around the country that would come there, and it would be mixed with Buddhist teachings. And I got very into Buddhism, moved to Boulder in, I think, about 1975, and was involved in that community for about 5 years or so. It got fairly intensive, kind of culminating with a 3-month retreat in Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, which was meant to be the gateway into the full tantric teachings. But I think somewhere along the line, I was having some doubts, general doubts about organized religion, but also about the difference between being in kind of a discipline and being in a cult. And I think I was just getting uneasy with it. So that's when I was also, doing these jobs to support my habit, if you will. And they were menial jobs. I had one I remember was kind of throwing mail and Neodata. It was this big kind of mail warehouse where I was in the middle, and there were all these bags around, and you kind of throw to different zip codes, and it was kind of like basketball, you kind of throwing mail in the different bags. And so that was one. And then after the seminary I talked about, I was hired by a Buddhist to be a parts manager at an RV factory. where they made basically the bodies for the recreational vehicles, those really ugly things you see, driving around. And so I was in the middle of this big kind of warehouse floor and handing out parts, and I hurt my back. I had actually done it previously, building the house in Maine, but then it came back, and it was it required back surgery and fusing of the disc. And what that did was it qualified me for a bunch of state assistance, state and federal. So I was able to get, one, I got job counseling, which was kind of interesting. So I went through a lot of testing, and I aced all my tests because I'd been to a good college. And they were lining up these interviews for my career, and it was kind of a weird mix. I remember the interview at Ball Brothers, and they were setting one up at Famous Footwear, and it was not, I was not inspired.
So through all of that, through, deciding not to go to law school, through building the house, through traveling the country, through Buddhism, what did you learn during that period that shaped your thinking later in life?
Well, I think one of the things I learned, I mentioned some about my early upbringing, boarding school and somewhat privileged, I guess. We weren't that wealthy, but we grew up on 20 acres of land, and we had lots of animals, and all went to private schools. And it was kind of disconnected from the real world. So I think part of doing that was to kind of break through my patterns of just kind of, whether it's in direct feedback that you get in Gestalt or Encounter, or whether in spiritualism, kind of meditation. I did a lot of meditation, retreats all alone and group meditations. And I think there was a kind of a perspective that developed, a little bit of perhaps a distance from my own ego. That comes and goes, but it did alter my general world view. And I think the challenge was to come back from that and say, what am I going to do with my life? I mean, do I want to be a monk? Which I think I did not. And then, what is it that would inspire me? So that was, I was in this kind of consulting, kind of being told where I could go for interviews and things. And I saw this ad in the local Daily Camera, the Boulder Daily Camera. And it was just a weird ad. It was Fremco, Front Range Educational Media Corporation. And it's like public media station, something like that, about to, going to go on the air, and was looking for a volunteer coordinator. And I'd organized some stuff in the Buddhist community, film events and things like that. And it was paid, half the salary would have been paid because of my injury by what's called a CETA program. So it just, public media has always intrigued me. I mean, I didn't have a TV. We didn't have a TV till I was 13, but, I remember watching Fire Line with my father, and and remember building a house in Maine, listening to the Watergate hearings on public radio and watching them at night on NewsHour. So I had an affinity for it, and it kind of fit in with my general idealism at the time. So I knew absolutely nothing about Fremco, and I went to this interview. It was in this old building in Lafayette, Colorado. It was on the second floor. It's kind of basically in shambles, all this used furniture, old desks lying around. And, it was a group interview, and John Schwartz, who was the founder of Front Range, what became KBDI, and John is, a very intense guy. He basically, by himself, filled out the whole FCC application. He identified one of the two remaining VHF channels in the country. KBDI became channel 12. He applied for it. He got a construction permit. And he kind of did all this. He had some trust funds, so that was funding to kind of initially get everything going. Most of the people that were there were, it was a combination of volunteers and about a handful of people that were paid minimum wage. And that was what I jumped into. And as a volunteer, so my first project was bizarrely enough to organize an on-air TV auction. So here we are, a TV station that's not on the air with people who have never done TV before. The ones who know anything came out of radio pretty much. And I'm there calling up potential volunteers for a television auction.
Well, that's fascinating. An auction for a TV station that's not on the air. Before I forget it, let me ask you about the call letters. Did Schwartz come up with the call letters and when he did the application? Because KBDI is
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah, that was definitely thought through in advance by some process that I had nothing to do with. Not only that,
So
we had a contest for the logo, and so everybody could submit it. And I was not part of the judging at that point. I was just a lowly volunteer coordinator. But there was this guy it really did look like some creepy guy, peering around the corner and up to no good. So that was our logo. It changed somewhere over the period of years. So yes, that was our what we looked like and what we started with. So I was all of this was premised on this kind of unreal notion that we were going to be on the air. But the other station, KRMA, had gotten wind of this. I think they were a little bit late, so they got wind of it as, when John got the construction permit, and they were freaked out. I mean, the idea of having a second public television station potentially competing with them for resources and, viewers, they were totally against, and they petitioned to keep KBDI off the air. And it was a pretty intense thing. And at that point, having the construction permit did not mean you could go on the air. But what happened was, and this is totally out of the blue, I don't think KBDI had anything to do with it. The FCC dropped that requirement. So it basically said you can go on the air with a construction permit. You still need to get the broadcast license eventually, but you can be on the air before that time. So that just happened out of the blue. So suddenly you have this kind of motley crew of people, some are kind of wannabe Jonathan Demme's out there shooting rock and roll concerts and a lot of great stuff, probably poorly shot and unusual today, on 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch tape. But suddenly it's all of this means we're going to go on the air. So we didn't have line of sight in Broomfield. So we had to move in Lafayette. So we had to move to Broomfield, where we had line of sight to Squaw Mountain, which is one of the highest mountains in Colorado. It's 11,000 feet high. And I think we are still largest or highest transmitter tower in the country. But that's where the transmitter was built, and it was built.
But you didn't have line of sight when you first started up, as I take it. You actually had to drive to the mountaintop in order to.
Yes, yeah, that's once we're on the air. So we had the two things. One is this license was originally intended for the University of Colorado in Boulder. And the original studio was in Lafayette, right outside of Boulder. But once we could go on the air, we needed to have line of sight to our transmitter site, which was on Squaw Mountain. And for that, we had to move to Broomfield. But then when we first went on the air, we did not have the microwave link set up. In other words, normally you send your signal up to the transmitter and then it's transmitted out. But we didn't have the link from the studio in Broomfield to Squaw Mountain yet. So all the programs that we were running when we first went on the air had to be driven up to the top of the 11,000-foot mountain. So every day there were these trips with the tapes that would go up.
No snow?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stories about stuff that happened on Squaw Mountain. We used to have like somebody would basically live up there, and I think somebody died up there once.
Oh.
It was a pretty remote location. So that was the challenge was to get on the air, which we did. Even with doing all of that, we weren't at that point qualified for CPB funding. We weren't a member of PBS. So we basically had no funding outside of John Schwartz's trust fund, and he was very careful about how he spent that money. So it was a very kind of tight organization with very little funds. So at that point, our first thing we needed to do was to raise money, and the most obvious way to raise money is have a pledge drive. So I somehow, we hadn't really established clear lines of who's doing what, but I think I just started working on what are we going to show. And I did that with another guy, Nick Fraser, who was one of the kind of key people at KBDI. I think he then went on to WLIW in Long Island. But we basically put together a schedule. So Nick was working primarily with sources like Sika, now NITA, I think, and kind of getting a lot of these cooking shows and old shows that weren't part of the PBS, but they were public television offerings, just a lot older ones. And then I was looking at things from public domain and different films that I could get from Kit Parker or Budget. And I think John actually got the first TV show, which was Twilight Zone, which was kind of a big hit for us.
Yeah.
And I got a bunch of others, Burns and Allen and Alfred Hitchcock and Have Gun Will Travel. So we just put those.
So you must have had the mechanism kind of in place then from the auction to take the pledges and so forth.
Well, what we had in Broomfield was a big warehouse. So so one part of it was the studio, and so we built a phone bank, and so I mean, it's just basically building the stuff from scratch, and the phone bank isn't that big a deal. But and we scheduled a program, a pledge drive, and I'm trying to remember what we had in there, but we had some very weird programs, and Night of the Living Dead. We had Give Me Shelter, the Rolling Stones. I don't know if these really were public domain, but they seemed like they were at the time. I think things got a lot stricter when cable came in and all of this. And then we had local shows we had started. One was Off the Wall, and I think the special during the pledge drive was on transsexuals, and so we just had a whole bunch of things, and the phones were ringing. I mean, especially I think Night of the Living Dead and the Rolling Stones, they went crazy. We didn't realize it. We'd never done this before, so I don't think we realized that the fulfillment rate of people watching Mick Jagger at midnight might not be that great. So the actual.
So you've got go ahead.
Well, I'd say we had a certain euphoria at the time that, hey, we're doing this. This is TV, and we're getting all this. We're getting these members and everything, and I think the reality of what we actually got in was a little bit more sobering.
So let me take just a step back. So would you say before I do step back, would you say the first drive was a success then? And as well as the auction was a success?
Well, we never did an auction. No, we
Oh,
did
you
auction.
didn't do the auction.
No, we never, it didn't make any sense. I mean, you know,
Okay.
the effort, and as you know, I mean, probably at least on the TV side, auctions are not, yeah, they're very labor intensive. We did eventually do
Oh,
auction where we farmed it out basically, and
sure.
other people came in with furniture and did an auction. But we did a few, we did some travel auctions, and yeah, but they're not they're not really good net revenue generators. And you don't have any viewing audience. So you're basically giving up your audience to do on-air sales. So no, but initially, no, we did not have the resources to really pull it off.
So you were euphoric from the first drive, though, until
Yeah,
reality hit.
yeah. And it was my first, well, actually, no, my first on air, because the first thing we did when we went on air was to basically bash KRMA. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean, that's what we basically, because we needed to use our air to stay on the air. So we had spots. And I think the first TV spot I ever cut was, KRMA is trying to keep us off the air. If you think they should stop that, call them up, tell them. But we think there is a place for us in this community, and we need your support. So we had a bunch of different spots. Mine was one of a number of them, and we just ran those quite a bit.
So you're on the air. You've had the first drive, but what was KBDI modeled after? Was it modeled after another television station?
No, it was modeled after radio, and
Hmm.
specifically, I've mentioned Jeremy Landsman is, I think, our kind of wacky engineer who pretty much built the station, but he had built stations, radio stations around the country. I think KRA Crab Radio in Seattle, KDNA in St. Louis, KFAT in California. I think he was even involved in the one in Madison, WORT, initially. He was close with one of the patron saints of alternative radio, Lorenzo Milam, who wrote what's famous within the alternative radio universe, Sex and Broadcasting. And I remember visiting KBDI. And so the idea was to have public television station that kind of was inspired by that spirit of independent radio, alternative radio, to have voices of the community, to be very community focused, to have kind of alternative fare. But the reality of actually running a TV station, nobody really had a clue about. So it doesn't, you would know, having been in radio and somewhat exposed to TV, there are some similarities, but very different. I mean, just the cost of the transmission and the cost of the infrastructure for TV is a lot more expensive than for radio, and the content, and you're reaching, we had a signal that, reached wide, throughout, it had a lot of different places where it, patches where it didn't get in, but it still reached up to Wyoming and, kind of way out in the plains. So it was just a level of magnitude that was quite a lot different.
So there's a really interesting interview on YouTube of Jeremy when he was at KDNA. He was young. It was just very interesting. So he was a unique person, as was John Schwartz.
They were both unique, and John actually had to resign for us to get on the air because part of KRMA's argument was John was unfit to be manager, because when he was in Pittsburgh Public Radio, I think maybe WYEP,
It was, yes.
they had it wasn't self-serving at all by John, but salaries were donated back to the station and then used as matching, used as non-federal financial. So you had federal dollars coming in here and then essentially being laundered to be used to match to raise up their non-federal financial support to increase their CPB grant. I think that's essentially the gist of it. And I don't think it was done with any nefarious goals in mind, but it was not appropriate, not good. And so that was one of the key arguments that KRMA was making to keep KBDI off the air, that John Schwartz was unfit to be the president of this corporation. So John resigned and Jeremy became president. And Jeremy has a lot of strengths, but management was not one of them.
Is not one?
No.
So what about the social and political climate during that period of time? So it's before 1980 when the station went on the air, I believe. Jimmy Carter is still president. What was the social and political climate like within the station?
Oh, within the station, when you say the social political climate, like who was attracted to it, who came to it, because it was like it was highly attractive to certain people, sometimes for the good reasons, sometimes not. So you had, certain production types who I think wanted to be rock and roll producers. So we're really into kind of covering, I think we did Telluride bluegrass and all of this kind of from some really bad and whatever. So they had their motivations, which were a little more selfish. You had the idealists who were just volunteering time because they believed in kind of the 60s energy of that mainstream media was essentially kind of corrupt and that this would be a true grassroots movement. So you had, I think, a significant amount of that idealism. You had young people who wanted to just get in the industry. So I think the overall sense was of that kind of commitment to doing something different. But within that, you had a lot of different agendas that were going on. So it was a difficult place, as I got higher up in the management part, it was a difficult culture to kind of manage. I mean, very creative in some ways, a lot of entrepreneurial, a lot of people willing to kind of do things, but not a what's the word? I mean, dysfunctional, but not overall. I think I appreciate it in hindsight.
Well, let me zone in on the dysfunctional. Oh, sure. Somewhere I found a clip that appeared in the Boston Globe, and it read, "The first year was bizarre. At station breaks, announcers would say, 'Hey, man, this is KBDI Broomfield.' Microphones died, reels of tape fell out of machines, programs were inexplicably canceled. The Marx Brothers couldn't have done it any better." That was written by Robert Dittelbach in the Boston Globe.
In the Boston Globe, we had a lot of articles that were written in the early days. They got more positive, and even that one is, it's kind of it was sort of a fascination with KBDI. What are they doing? And I remember coming in one day and we're running Have Gun Will Travel, and the film was upside down. So, anybody watching, they've got to be either standing on their head or they think they're on the wrong drug or something. But
my goodness.
So yeah, it was all over the map. I mean, one of the early programs that was locally originated was it was originally called FMTV and then morphed into Teletoons, but it was rock and roll videos. And this was before MTV had come along. So at 11 o'clock every night, we would tune to like rock videos. And so a lot of them, I mean, they were the mainstream ones, but then there were the real, there were things that weren't mainstream at the time, Talking Heads and Laurie Anderson, and just some very cool stuff. But the whole concept, I mean, my daughter today has an old Teletoon t-shirt, and when she wears it in Denver, people still come up to her. And so it had this, like, on what were then like teenage kids were absolutely glued to this program.
So did MTV get the idea from you?
I have no idea. It's I guess I'd love to think they might have. I mean, we also started a program called Home Movies, which actually was originally started by the inspiration was a guy, Doug Cruikshank, who was a really creative kind of independent critic and filmmaker. But he drafted me as well. So we were the co-host of this show for a few years. And it was fascinating. It was, we would get these kids. It was mostly kind of high school kids, but it had a mix of people who would come in. And the deal was that, we show their film and then they got to talk about it. So we had, this was a warehouse and we put up one of the big sliding doors right behind master control or in front of master control and this old couch. And Doug and I would sit on this couch and the filmmaker would sit between us and we show his film and then Doug would interview the guy as if he were like Martin Scorsese. What about that shot? What were you thinking?
So these were unique programs, broke some ground.
Yes. I mean, whether there's a link between that and American's Funniest Home Videos that came later, who knows? But it was before, it was an idea that, was before its time. Yeah. So,
Mhm.
and actually pretty interesting. I mean, it was interesting to be part of it. And so we did that. We also did, I don't know if I'm getting off my timeline at all, but we started this thing called theme nights where we would focus on a particular issue. So I think the one that was really that I remember the most because it was something that I was inspired to do by going to an ascertainment. Do you remember ascertainment meetings? Did you have them
I
in the
do.
side?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they were kind of, I think people just took them for granted, like you had to do them. That was an FCC requirement. And I used to go to them, and I was at one where the FEMA, Federal Emergency folks were talking. This one guy was talking about nuclear war, and he seemed to be like nostalgic. He said it'll be kind of like the 1800s. I was watching him, and he actually seemed like he was like couldn't wait, and it kind of freaked me out. We we actually got our first grant from Colorado Humanities. It was a smaller grant, like $13,000, and we produced like 5 nights on the threat of nuclear war, and we had these programs, war games, I think, from Britain and Dark Circle, but also a lot of panels and a lot of discussion, and that's all we did nights for like 5 nights, and we had people going up to Warren Air Force Base where the missiles are in Wyoming to NORAD in Colorado Springs, touring that. We had all these kind of footage and material that we'd gotten from around Colorado. And I can't say it was great television, but it was definitely kind of worthwhile to kind of. So that became a model for sort of doing these. We did nights on El Salvador, on homelessness, it was like a regular part of our schedule, and every month we would do a theme night.
So somewhere along the line, though, you became the program director, and Nick Fraser had something to do with that, correct?
Yeah, depending who you talk to, Nick did all the work and I got all the glory. Nick was like, I mean, an amazing, he's unfortunately passed away, but
Yeah.
he just was a workhorse, and he had this big white shepherd that we shared an office, but he really put the schedule together, and he took a lot of the, as I said, a lot of the material. And once we got our membership into PBS, he kind of really worked on putting the schedule. I mean, I would have to sign off on that part, but I did that, but I was also just the one looking for the things that would be outside of all that. So I had deals with the Canadian Film Board, which had some great material, different independent filmmakers, and then the whole public domain and the commercials, because this was before cable. And so there was a lot of content that if the local affiliates in Denver didn't buy them, was just sitting fallow. So I could negotiate, amazingly cheap prices for things like the World of Disney. People loved, and but I'm paying like $100 a run or something for it. And so it was kind of a mix of these things that would be very alternative, and then also just kind of a mainstream, like nostalgia type programming, and then starting to blend in the PBS program.
So, at what point then had you become a PBS member?
That would have been fairly early on, because once we got the CPB funding, I think then we had to become a PBS member. So I think the CPB funding would have come, I think Ron Hall was part of the visiting team that came. And that's when I realized all the people in DC were not jerks. He was just a wonderful guy and a very open guy. And but that would have been likely pretty shortly after we went on air. So I think probably at least by 1981. I mean, nobody was fighting that at that point. We were on the air. Once we were CPB qualified, which we would have had to been, because there wasn't really any discretion. We were meeting the criteria. We needed a minimum of NFFS, which we've met. And so that the big deal with PBS was what's called the Program Differentiation Fund, because we couldn't afford to be a full member. And frankly, we didn't want to be a full member, because that would have meant, totally head to head with KRMA. So we had policy, and I was actually on this task force with PBS, coming up with what would be the right PDP formula for stations. And, to me, that was one of the most significant successes that we had in those early years, because it was pretty generous to us when I look back on it. It allowed us we had to have a 1-week delay on primetime programming, no delay on fundraising programming, and for a portion of the price. So it was significantly less expensive than it would have been otherwise, and it gave us the freedom to kind of just pick and choose, and also in a kind of a ruthless way to really monetize the fundraising program. And I used to call it guerrilla pledge. I mean, while we couldn't, some of the programs which were part of the schedule we had to wait on, but we would come in before the national pledge drive. So we would do weekends and stuff. So we would, when you get a hit show, I forget what they could have been, anything from, Susie Orman to, Riverdance or whatever, it usually survives more than one pledge drive. So we would kind of come and strategically figure out when, before the second pledge, how we would run these programs into the ground. And it was very, when I look back on it, kind of, ruthless, competitive. I don't think it really hurt KRMA. I think they were big enough and they had their established audience, but it certainly didn't make them happy.
Yeah, by that time, with your kind of ruthless approach to pledge drives, were you doing direct mail and other forms of a membership?
Yeah, we were. I wouldn't say we were particularly sophisticated with it. but you know, we were doing a lot of that. Yes.
What about underwriting?
Yeah, we had, I don't have my numbers, but we were seeking underwriting right from the beginning, and
Huh?
it wasn't a major, you know, the major revenue source was pledge funding. And then that kind of grew incrementally each year. Underwriting was a challenge because we weren't, you know, we had a reputation that some people liked. But you know, it was not a mainstream reputation. I mean, it was definitely a little bit in your face. I mean, we took a lot of chances on content. We aired some very controversial programs, and it wasn't. And we had KRMA in the market, so KRMA was the established public TV station, and they would be more likely the ones that, you know, major underwriters already had working relationships with. So,
Tell me a little bit, though, about the decision to do underwriting, because I believe that's a philosophical kind of thing that maybe Pacifica doesn't even do underwriting now. So you grew out of Pacifica, but the corporate kind of effort toward underwriting, was there any controversy about that in the station?
no, I think the only one I remember, I mentioned the nuclear war. I'm trying to look at the 5 nights on 1981, I think, but we did that. I remember, you know, we put a ton of work into this, and people were very into it, and I think the first night went really well. And I remember Jeremy Lansman coming into my office and saying, "I think we need to break into this programming and run underwriting and maybe pledge." And I just looked at him and said, "No, no, Jeremy, we can't do it." And Jeremy kind of skulked away.
Interesting.
20 minutes later, I got an email saying, "You obviously know what you want to do. I think you should be the interim manager." So you kind of, but it, you know, that was the only, and it came from a kind of radical radio guy that,
Yeah.
oh, that we had no compunction. I think it was, and I don't see underwriting as a, I guess it could be depending upon who the underwriter was, but we never had any philosophical bias against it. I think it was more the other way around about who would want to be associated with us.
So while you were program director, you were the executive producer for a live event, a major live event. You know, not in the Boulder, Colorado area, but on the East Coast.
Yes, we did a lot of work with independents, and actually at nuclear war, we had there Kim Spencer was very involved in national kind of activist uh, television, and so we had a connections into the independent community. Even Doug Cruikshank, who I mentioned, edited something called "The Sky's No Limit," was an independent publication that he kind of produced out of our facility, and was a good friend of mine at that time. So this, I believe, it came around or right after the nuclear war series we did, and they were looking for carriage on public television stations, and the obvious thing would be if KBDI produced it, then it would be eligible. We could put it on satellite, and then it could be shown at any public television station around the country. So, and also I had been involved with a lot of them. So I was asked to be the executive producer. So I actually, I think it was what, 82? I'm looking at my notes
Yeah,
for it.
82.
Yeah, I actually went to New York. I stayed with a friend for a month. And I wrote a long article in The Sky's No Limit. Actually, I was just reviewing it a while ago, but I came out of the whole experience a little bit jaded, but mostly jaded about rock and roll musicians. But um, we put together for almost no money. I think we raised like $3,000 or something. And, you know, we covered, it was the largest rally, I think, in the history of the country at that point. It was a nuclear disarmament, and it fills like Central Park. And we had, you know, all kinds of independent producers and filmmakers and camera people involved in it, volunteering their time. And you know, we pulled it off. It was a sloppy production in some way. I mean, it was obviously had a liberal bias. um, it the musicians wouldn't let their agents. We couldn't actually. They cut the chords. You couldn't actually hear the music when it was played because the music business didn't want that. So we got, you know, you'd hear Orson Welles' speech or Yoko Ono, and but the actual music, you know, Bruce Springsteen or James Taylor or Linda Ronstadt was, you know, all static. So it was kind of odd that way. So it got panned. There was a New York Times editorial that was actually very critical of the show, but even more critical of WNET for not having produced it. So
But
WNET,
did they carry it?
they carried it. Yeah, they carried it.
Oh.
And other stations around, I forget how many carried it. So, and the fact that we pulled it off was pretty amazing. But if I look back on it, you know, it's impossible to have done it with that lack of resources. And I would do it differently, put it that way.
But it's really interesting. They turned to you as executive producer rather than going to NET. I suspect NET had a different focus at that point.
Yeah, I don't know that they ever went to WNET, or they thought, I don't think that,
Okay.
but they may have, and I don't think WNET had any interest. I mean, this would have been somewhat political, although they carried it live, so that's interesting. You would think they would have put some effort into the production itself. And I'd probably
So
be,
are there other accomplished, go ahead.
no, I'd probably be too hard on it. It was an amazing effort and an amazing experience to be part of it. And the fact that we pulled it off with, you know, people who
Yeah.
never worked together all over New York come in, and you know, that was all pretty phenomenal.
So you've talked about a lot of your accomplishments during the time that you were the program director. Are there any that we left out?
Well, I think this may have been when I was GM, so I'm just looking. Yeah, I think it gets later when, you know, even when I was the manager, I kept a hand in the programming. So
Yeah.
um, I mean, that was kind of something I never really gave up. I was mainly on the kind of special things that I cared about and stuff. So, you know, some of the
So
things, you know, decisions, and with that, we get into that later with starting Colorado Inside Out and
right.
Tongues Untied, and
So you became the manager. You'd been successful as the program director. You had the support within the station, and you became the manager. But becoming the manager was at a probably stressful in the in the early going. Tell us about that.
well, the first board meeting was the number one topic was whether or not we should declare bankruptcy. So, which had not come up before. So, so it's not exactly a welcome party. How you doing? This is going to be fun. It was are we going to be able to dig
Most people get 6 months, of a honeymoon. You didn't.
No, no, but I had been, you know, I'd been kind of the interim for a while, and frankly, the previous overall management had, you know, not been particularly good. So it was, I probably should have expected it. Maybe that was a little bit harsher than I thought it would be, but it was it was the challenge of KBDI that I always had to kind of wrestle with, is great ideals of what we wanted to do, and then just the limitations of not having funding. I mean, we didn't have institutional funding, state funding, university funding. We didn't have major donors, in that same way, major grants. So it really was a grassroots effort. And so how do you kind of be idealistic, which I was idealistic, and how do you kind of fulfill that mission of kind of alternative television, what became for us increasingly First Amendment television, of kind of showing a lot of different voices and really kind of taking on tough topics. I mean, how do you do that? And how do you do the business of, I mean, there's a reason why a lot, even a public television is kind of, I mean, I don't want to say dull, but it's kind of non-threatening, put it that way, is, you're hampered some by your funding sources. We're hampered by federal government funding, and on one hand, we wouldn't exist without it, or the institutional funding with its own expectations. So how do you be really independent, and how do you kind of have a healthy financial structure?
So there had been a series of managers, Schwartz, Jeremy, Tony Esposito, I think, had been the manager for had been from at PBS, had come out and was the manager for a period of time.
I think he was in the distribution. I don't know that. I think it was the allure of somebody at PBS must know what they're doing. I was not involved in that hiring, and being as not speak ill of anybody, but he was not a good choice to be a manager of the station.
But you pulled it out of this conversation, your first board meeting. Should we declare bankruptcy? You pulled it out of that. How did you do it? Because that's quite an accomplishment.
Well, I think one is I do have a combination of sort of idealism and pragmatism. So I mean, I think we basically had to say, what do we need, and what don't we need, and we just had to pay attention. I think having a good business manager, somebody who could be honest with me about where we were on things. I think just getting a discipline. I mean, it was never easy. It wasn't like we suddenly were out of trouble. I mean, we had, different cycles over, certainly the first 5 years or so. And then I think, the pledging, there were different experiments we did that worked. And I think specifically this, the notion of the First Amendment, and remember, KRMA at that time had just come out of the school board. KRMA was very conservative, and so they were a very good, in a way, it was good for us to have them in some way. But so we were totally not that, and we got a lot of good press for being kind of willing to kind of show things and to question things, and we did that. And one example, and I'm trying to remember what year it was 91, but a little bit later on. But this was one of those pivotal moments where a program that came out of PBS, Tongues Untied, I think it was part of POV. I think Jennifer Lawson, for credit, was probably the one at PBS behind that. It's not a program you would ever see today, I don't think, out of PBS. I don't mean that critically, I'm just saying I don't think it would arise to that. But a very graphic program, very a really well done program, but about the Black experience, about the gay Black experience. It has kind of graphic poetry, language, and kind of in your face language. And it's not a program that most public stations, if they aired it at like 3 in the morning. I think Seattle had it at 3 in the morning, but a lot of stations
Right.
just, and we not just aired it, but we pledged. Oh, and it was a gamble. I mean, if for us at that point, it was, to actually pledge something that out there. I mean, we knew it was a good program, but we also knew it would tick off a lot of people. And it's one of those pledge breaks I wish I'd kept, because most of my pledge breaks got very redundant. But this one was actually, probably the most inspired I had been. And it went on. The pledge break went on for literally half an hour. I mean, I think when it started, we didn't know what we thought. Maybe bomb threats, maybe a lot of hate calls, and it was just like support. And it just was like took over. And we had, the phone bank just going absolutely crazy. And it just was a kind of one of those moments in time where you're doing what you want to do and you have the support to do it. So it kind of was one of those pivotal definitional moments for KBDI. And it led
So
to
in a way, and you ran it in prime time. You pledged it. Things like Teletoons, then Tongues Untied, the other things that you did, again, in a way, were cutting new ground for society today.
uh yes, you could look back on some had more notoriety. Tongues Untied had a lot of notoriety. Others, a lot of the theme nights we did were really questioning, environmental homelessness, things like that. So sometimes, I don't know if you ever heard of Paul Bortz. Paul Bortz is I think he's still around, but a highly regarded media consultant analyst, and especially in the commercial world. But he was on our board for a number of years, and I just remember him telling me one time, I said, "Ted, if you're ahead of your time, you're wrong."
Interesting. Well, I think actually it's proven that you were right.
Well, it did not make me rich and famous, but I don't know, but he was coming from this ultra pragmatic, really good guy, but just very sharp guy, and ultra pragmatic world of what, ratings, numbers, and all of that, which was not quite how KBDI operated. Uh,
Well, but did you pay attention to ratings?
yes, yes. Oh my God, I forget when did that come in, we would get overnights in the Denver market. And every morning I would look at those ratings, or Nick would, and share them. And
Really?
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it mattered. I paid attention to ratings. I paid attention to pledge. I mean, I had to pay attention to everything as the manager. And it was really interesting. There's something, well, we talked about this before, but is what did it take to kind of break through numbers? So we would have, you know, what today would be considered great ratings, because today everybody's audience is on broadcast, it's plummeted. But
Right.
back then we were always, maybe half of KRMA, even if we ran the same program, whatever. It was, we just, and I experimented. I remember getting one film series from a national distributor. I used to meet with these guys when they came to Denver, because they would see everything they could sell to all the commercial folks, and then I would meet with them, see what was left in the dustbin there. But I got this one film series of all, like, major films from a few years ago. And the one I remember was Platoon. You remember Platoon? Oliver
Oh,
Stone and won Academy Award for Best Picture, and
yes.
all these stars in it, Johnny Depp and all these people. Um and I put it in, it was in obviously prime time, and it got, for us, good. It got like a 3.5 or something, which was, but if that had been airing on the NBC affiliate, it would have gotten like a 10 or something. So there was a sort of built-in limitation, I think, to being a second public television station, that there were people that just either were not aware of it, We didn't have much of a marketing. I mean, we had some, but not much. And it just didn't fit in there. It wasn't in their habitual viewing. So there was a limit, I guess, for what, I think our strength was in finding niche audiences. So we built a very strong, LGBTQ audience. I mean, we did
Right.
local, we did, I had regular weekly programs. And it was an audience that we intentionally cultivated, a really kind of smart, a good public television audience, frankly, but not one that had been intentionally cultivated in the way that we did. But that's different than an audience that would jump up in the ratings. So I think that was kind of the challenge, is finding those niches that would work. And sometimes controversy, like we ran, there's a Noam Chomsky documentary we ran, things like that.
Sure.
And a lot of those kinds of programs that were speaking to a specific audience that would respond and would be very supportive.
So you ran Noam Chomsky, yet, and this may not have been the exact time period, but it's I think it's a good comparison. You ran Rush Limbaugh.
Yes, we did run Rush Limbaugh, and that was we were the only public station in the country, and trying to remember what year that was, but that was probably in the 90s. It was a program that the Rush's TV show was not doing that well, I guess, and the Denver station, commercial station, had dropped it. And this was something where my pledge manager came into me and said, what if we were to pick up that program? And I mean, at first it just sounded totally bizarre. I mean, Rush Limbaugh was, in my mind, a kind of forerunner of some of the politics today, but kind of a totally out there. But on the other hand, it was an audience that we were kind of pigeonholed somewhat as a liberal, kind of lefty alternative audience. And yet we talked about the First Amendment and being open. So it was kind of a challenge to think about it that way. So both pragmatically, could we reach an audience, and also just philosophically saying, it's not like Russia's going to convert our audience. Matter of fact, one of the programs, I think it was Thursday night, led into a gay lesbian program. So it was one of the more interesting segues when we did a pledge break. But so it was a big gamble. And I think we lost the number of Boulder people in that. Boulder is very, very liberal, and not in a bad sense,
Sure.
but so there were people who were very offended by it, but there were people, actually very, really well spoken, who would like comment and very enthusiastic about us being willing to do that. And it was only, I think it only ran with us for about 6 months or so. I can't remember the exact time frame, but it did cause a stir. And
But it the First Amendment, television, it seems like a logical thing to have done.
yeah, it is. I think it's the whole idea of the First Amendment is something I've thought about a lot more lately, as it's kind of things have gotten taken to extremes. And I think maybe what I miss, remember when there used to be the fairness doctrine? And
Yes.
and I'd have to go back and read the actual wording, but essentially there was an obligation by a broadcaster. It wasn't that you couldn't run something, but that there be some kind of balance. And I think that's
equal time. There was equal time and there was the fairness doctrine, and
and
all of that's out the window now.
Yes, and I think that's maybe where some of the, if I look at some of the big problem today, is that we've kind of lost that. And so I mean, there was absolutely no doubt with KBDI that Rush Limbaugh did not control our airwaves. It would go at, I think, 11 o'clock at night or something, 10:30, 11, and very strong opinions. And I also actually worked with a a conservative think tank in Denver, the Independence Institute, to run a weekly show of theirs that aired on, afternoons on the weekend. So it was, but that was a lot more thoughtful conservatism. It included libertarian views and was, not a bad show. I mean, it's not a show I particularly agreed with, but it wasn't a bad show. And then we started, I was executive producer on a local show that's actually still on the air today, Colorado Inside Out. We started, with the intention of having a talking head show that wasn't just a bland, like a lot of those shows that you see that are kind of intentionally non-controversial. So we went out looking for people that were smart but had strong opinions, kind of put them together. So we had the editor of the alternative weekly Westward magazine that is still on the air, actually. Or she's still the editor. The program's still on the air. And we had folks from the Denver Post, the Rocky Mountain News, and other places, but they were just really good, smart people. So the concept made a lot of sense, and it became pretty popular. And then, as I said, like 40 years later, it's still
there.
Yeah, still a mainstay.
And all of that led to a First Amendment award, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It was the ACLU award for, I came out of the blue, but yes. Because I was the face of all this. I mean, I was,
Yeah.
and so I would get the criticism or the praise off, critics like the Rocky Mountain News, Dusty Saunders, or Clark Seacrest, Denver Post. They wrote articles, which they did. There are a number of. Usually, I was the point person for that. So yes, that was I think the ACLU award, and the other was mentioned. They kind of linked together, the Broadcast Citizen Award from the Colorado Broadcasters Association. So I became an establishment guy.
Yeah, you did, and not only an establishment guy within kind of programming and KBDI, but also you were involved on a national level in a way that perhaps some other stations that were of an alternative nature, their general managers weren't. So you got involved on a national basis kind of from the beginning.
Yeah, I was. I mentioned the PBS one, which was probably one of the more, because it actually changed or created a policy that worked, at least worked for the smaller stations in those markets. But I also was fairly early on invited to be part of some of the CPB ones, and I think back then it was Fred DeMarco, Doug Weiss, Connie Foster, Laura, I'm forgetting, went to NPR. And I'm not sure why. I think initially because overlap was a big kind of a contentious issue. So when they did reviews or whatever, they wanted to have a token, somebody from that. And if you looked at the mix out there of who was available, I think I was considered maybe, whatever the reasons, they tended to like me better. So I was trying to think, Pagliarini was another who was on a lot of these, and Byron at some point was on some of them. But I was sort of the voice for that, and it wasn't only that, but it was, so I was I think it worked both ways. I mean, I think it was good for the system because I also was pretty outspoken at national meetings. Probably a pain in the ass for some people, but I was very adamant about the rights of being a smaller station in a multi-station market, and that that should be appreciated, that the differences should be appreciated, that it was actually a strength for public broadcasting. And I believe that if that other station is not just a pale imitation of the larger station. I don't know that that's in fact the case in many situations. But that was a case that I made, that we should be supporting everybody, and it shouldn't be as competitive. But it got into other issues as well. So some of my evolution or socialization, another name I should mention, because I think he was the first guy who brought me in from the cold, if you will. That was Joe Zespa at Pacific Mountain Network, which was based in Denver. And I had looked at, in the early days of KBDI, we just looked at everybody else in public media as basically kind of conservative, and that we didn't fit in. We were like the wild child.
Right.
And
Right.
we didn't like them, they didn't like us, so we didn't care about them. Maybe would be the right way. But Joe kind of made a point of coming up at one point, and just, he came on our pledge drives, and he was, I don't know if you ever met him, but just an incredibly friendly guy and smart guy. And he became a friend, but he got me into joining Pacific Mountain Network, which was kind of eventually got wound down. I was the chair at the time, but it started a socialization. I feel like I was like a wild child that gradually got socialized, and maybe that kind of compromised me in some way, but I got to understand some of the broader issues affecting the industry through the CPB discussions and being involved in the different affinity groups and all of this. And so it probably made me, I'm not quite sure, but it was part of my evolution.
So your station, Nancy Dobbs' station, and so forth. Were you accepted by the bigger, more established public television stations?
I don't know what would accepted would be. I remember being in, there was this one grand meeting, and I can't remember which year it was, with the big stations and the smaller stations in those markets. And it was all around this concept of, can we come together and find a vision that is inclusive? Is there a broader vision? Should we have multiple program schedules? Should we have a different program strand for these second or third stations? And it was, there were some expectations that something could actually come out of this, but it was pretty clear in the meeting that the larger stations really didn't have any interest. And I remember Bill Baker having a conversation with him, and he basically said, I don't want you to have any different program. I would prefer you ran Nature at the same time I ran Nature, than that you have another program on the air. And I didn't totally get the logic, but I guess, in some way I understand the general sensibility about the priority should be on a strong national service. It should not be on kind of trying to create another service that's going to compete with that strong service. And then I think the other thing, and this is my maybe criticism of my colleagues on the multi-station, on the smaller station side, so I think most of them just wanted to be just like the bigger ones. I mean, they didn't have an alternative vision particularly. And they just wanted to be able to run the high visibility shows and get, more pledge money and more underwriting, but they didn't have a sense of anything like First Amendment or any issue like that. It wasn't inspired by an alternative vision. May have been more realistic than our vision, but it wasn't inspired by that. So I didn't really fit into that group. If I looked at like WLIW or Utah, Provo, or San Jose, they did not, we talked a lot about how to get those guys, but it wasn't really common ground. So
So the national programming was important, but the local programming for KBDI was equally as important.
Yes, yes. And I think also in the national was having things beyond PBS, and PBS had a lot of great programming. But
Mhm.
Track Media would attest to that our viewing audience and our membership audience was largely a typical public television audience. It wasn't as if we built a core alternative base. It
So you
wasn't.
were sharing audience with what is now Rocky Mountain PBS,
Yeah,
RMA.
yeah, yeah. I think you had folks that were either members of both stations, or a lot more were members of KRMA, or ones that might have been members one year and then the next year were on the other station. That would be, at least from Track's kind of analysis, and it makes sense to me that we had, for all of our differences, we relied on a core, some of the key fundraising programs, especially, but even some of the other programs, nature and those things that we ran were the key ones that built the audience base. And then we would kind of, I mean, there were some exceptions, but that we didn't really, I don't know if succeed or not, but the reality was that we could not exist totally separate from the PBS core.
So I want to come back to programming in a little bit, but I want to take one step back to something I think we missed that I think is very interesting, and that is when you were applying to become the general manager, you took a personality test.
Yes. Well, one of our board members was the head of a local, I think it might have been Sinclair, but head of a local chain of kind of those urban newspapers around Colorado. And very smart guy, very kind of dapper, very witty, sharp, and was a longtime board member at KBDI. And so as part of the application process, I went down to his offices and they had a personality test I had to take. And what he said is, it's a great test. I took it. So I can vouch for it. And so I took it, and I mean, apparently I passed. I did okay. But a few years later, when I was manager, Westward, the alternative newspaper in Denver, had a big cover story with this guy on the cover who apparently, well, not apparently, but he did, as a college student, come home one day and basically killed his family, shot his parents and I think his sister, and then spent 7
Oh,
years in
goodness.
pediatric rehabilitation and sort of reinvented himself, and came out to Colorado and had sort of this dark, deep secret in his past that ultimately got revealed. So he obviously knew something about personality tests, but it was somebody with an
So,
MA.
so,
Makes me wonder.
so he passed the test, you passed the test.
Yeah, so I'm right up there with it. So that's,
So another thing I wanted to not skip over is that the physical plant for KBDI moved around a lot. You
yeah,
didn't just have one building and stayed there, and you moved a lot. So talk about the moves, and then also the physical plant. Did the equipment get better and so forth as time went on?
yeah. I at one point called us homeless. But so I spoke about moving from Lafayette to Broomfield, which we went on the air, so not as big a deal, but we had to be line of sight to Squaw Mountain. And we set up shop there, and it worked. It was pretty funky, and but as a place it worked. I had hired as development director a wonderful guy, Winston Laszlo, came from the film festival and was very much of a Denver based person. And he was adamant that we needed to be in Denver. So he made successful pitch, and he found a building right in downtown Denver, right on Stout Street, right in the middle of Denver. And these developers, real estate developers, who essentially, I think we were on the third floor or fourth floor, and they essentially retrofitted the whole floor for us. And it was a rent that we could afford. And so it was a big deal. We moved out of Broomfield, moved right into the heart of Denver. And we felt like we had finally had a more of an established home. But there was a rough real estate market in Denver, and the building basically went bankrupt. And so we lost the lease. And in a very short
You're
period,
evicted?
well, yeah, the building was taken over by it. Yeah, we had to move out in a very short time period. And I think we were there a couple of years, a year or two. And so we had to find this place, and we found, I think it used to be like an old grocery store, big building, warehouse type building, but more like a little more still kind of abandoned building on Federal Boulevard, which actually I liked till I was in the kind of Latino part of town, and it had some very cool restaurants and easy for me to commute to from Louisville. But it was kind of funky place, and we settled there. And then we hooked up with the foundation, the P-Town Foundation in Denver. And they had a building, used to be a bakery in the Five Points area of Denver. And Five Points is the historically Black section of Denver, has a really rich history, kind of a lot of jazz music and just the rich history of the Black community in Denver. And so they funded the rehab of the building, and we moved in there with KUBO, Hispanic radio, and kind of that's where it is today. And it was actually a good location. Yeah, I think some people were afraid, we're going to be in an unsafe part of Denver, and it was not. We had, our nighttime pledges and everything, and it was a great it was a great place to be. But that transition, moving a facility for the third time, was it just took a lot of research, and drained a lot.
So you mentioned Kuvo. Did you ever look at merging with Kuvo, because now it's with Rocky Mountain PBS, but you were in the same building. So did you ever look at merging?
No. I mean, Flo and I got along well, and we talked. We did. We weren't really. I don't know if either one of us were necessarily the best partner, because neither of us had a lot of resources to bring to the table. What we did do, and I had this notion of that public access would be a good partner. So we actually, I think I was an original kind of director, or sort of a hands-off, but we formed a partnership with the new kind of public access in Denver, and they moved into the third floor. So we had public access, Kubo, and us. And I thought it would be much more of a kind of link to local. And I think I kind of got humbled by the realities of public access, and its kind of restrictions about what can happen and what can't happen. And so it didn't really gel in the way I wanted, but it was one of those interesting failures. But no, Kubo, what's I guess interesting today is Kubo was absorbed by KRMA, Rocky Mountain PBS, and I think for the good. I think they're much more stable. They seem like they're doing really well, and that makes a ton of sense. I think the public access is now there as well. I sometimes think that the best thing we did in Colorado was to prod KRMA, because they are a much more interesting organization today than they were 20, 30 years ago. But they have a media center that has public access, actually has a Black radio station, has Kuvo.
Yes.
So,
and And just for the record, when you mentioned Flo Hernandez, who was the longtime general manager of Kuvo, which was largely a jazz station.
Yes, very good. I mean, it's one of my go-to stations. And she is still around. She might even be on the board of Rocky Mountain, but I've have not had direct contact in a while, but good person.
Yeah, definitely a good person. So all of them was, what about the technical plant in relationship cameras and recorders and transmitters and how did all of that play out?
Well, incrementally, and it was never going to be a leading edge technology wise. I mean, it was not a lot of funding. If we got PTFP. Actually, I think we might have been one of the few stations to get originally PTFP funding for half-inch decks, but it was a slog. I mean, our transmitter was actually a 30-year-old transmitter from the Midwest somewhere that was donated as long as we picked it up. Got reassembled, and so it was, in the early days, it was very much just kind of, Scotch tape stuff together and using, pretty much used equipment and things. It's gotten better, I think, primarily through PTFP, but it definitely is not on the forefront of technology in any sense of the word.
And PTFP was a program, Public Telecommunications Facilities Program, which was in the NTIA, and is no longer functioning, but supported a lot of stations' equipment needs over the years across the country.
Yes, no, I think it's a shame that program went away, but that was an absolute life changer for us. And the program officers, again, one of my kind of learning experiences was how good some of these so-called bureaucrats could be, but they worked with us a lot, and it's a tough one to replace. And so I don't know. I'd always thought, and we'll probably talk about this at some later discussion, but I think that challenge for the system, especially smaller stations going forward, about how to pay for all the technology is one that I don't know what the answer is at this point, but it certainly was a life changer for us.
And I think for most stations that ended up with PTFP grants. Star Wars, big movie, Cable Wars, though, affected you.
Yes. So we were, I'm trying to remember what year this was now. That's where I'm looking back on my notes, and so help me out. But
Sure.
Colorado was, a center for cable. That's where TCI cable, John Malone. So a lot of the cable
Mid 80s, 86.
yeah.
Mid
And
80s.
so when cable hit, one, it obviously changed the whole program field. I mean, the cost for like old content, TV content, all that became totally out of our reach. But they started messing with the channels, and today it's pretty commonplace. But we were, I think, the first channel that it was United Cable, I believe, that was going to move us from channel 12 to channel 46, and it seemed to us at the time that was like a death knell. That was like really just a nasty thing to do. And so we went, I mean, I got spots, so we were on air. We were basically giving out the phone number of the head cable guy in Denver. And I think I called it Siberia, that we were being exiled to Siberia. And I get pretty passionate sometimes on these things. So, but apparently the phone number we gave out was this guy's personal phone number. I don't know where we got it. So it came back to
Oh
us
my.
like really, really, really ticked off, and which I was very happy to hear, actually. Um, so it just, we lost. We never. I mean, I think the only saving grace was everybody ended up getting moved around, but it just felt like one of those at the time kind of our survival was being threatened, our existence. We were being like shunted out by a kind of
Well,
name.
a channel was a big deal in those days. A
Yeah,
channel number was a big
yeah,
deal.
yeah. Even that's true. And even people were encouraged to use that, not your call letters. We're 12,
Right.
all of that. So to have that be we're 12, but you find us on 46 was um that was not a good thing. And I think we basically survived it. I mean, we didn't have serious negative repercussions, but we were working probably at a, I think what happened maybe is that today everybody, and this is common now, right? I mean, I still have to sometimes screw around to find out where the broadcast channels are. I mean, they're all together,
Yeah.
but how to find
Yeah.
them on different services and things. So it was probably the precursor of a world that's gotten even more kind of disaggregated. And probably today, if we'd known where we'd be today, it would be a totally different approach.
But you put up a real solid fight regarding, ultimately you lost regarding the channel position on cable, but you put up a really strong fight.
Well, I did. I had a good op-ed and some cable bigwig. We had like dueling op-eds in the Denver Post, and I mean, we didn't. I mean, it was very visible, and we actually got a fair amount of support editorially for this. But the cable company was just absolutely not changing. I mean, sometimes these things you can make a fuss and things change, but so despite
And
all
the
that,
cable company, the FCC didn't have control over the cable company like the FCC had control over the broadcast station.
yeah, no,
Right.
there was no control. And as I said, when you look back on it, you say, well, that's kind of small potatoes considering the world we're in it today. But at the time, it was a big, I think kind of endemic. It always felt, and this was part of maybe evolution too, is there was always some struggle we had at KBDI. I mean,
Yeah.
it was these,
Yes.
it was, sometimes it was our own making, but other times it was just like feeling like we were dealing with these generally, non-carrying or hostile forces, whether it was the other public television station, the cable company, or landlord or something. It was it was that kind of against the world a little bit of that mentality. And it kept me on my toes. I remember once being in my degree, I mentioned my master's in Europa was East-West psychology, and we had this psychoanalyst who came out in the summer and ran one of our classes, one of the best classes I ever took. He used to be a comedy writer for Jerry Lewis. So he would have people both crying and laughing at the same time. But I remember he told me once, he said, you're really good when you're irritated. Yes, Ted, when you're irritated.
I've seen that. You are very very good. So you mentioned though the KRMA, the fight that went on there, and then the cable wars fight. But there was another fight that was coming in the mid '90s that affected not only KBDI but also other public television and public radio stations. And that was something called the Glide Path to Zero, which was part of Newt Gingrich's contract with America.
Mhm. Yeah, very serious threat at the time. And um, I think that was there was a phase, and this again was became a major CPB focus. But it was a very visible attempt to eliminate funding for public media. And at the time, the threat felt very real and very potentially like it would happen. So we were, I was part of a CPB task force. It was basically, that would have been the theme. What's the glide path to zero? What do you do? And what is going to happen to public media? And, it was one of those ones where, you had those folks, everybody had opinions about it, Doug Wise, Fred DeMarco, and we had good meals. We always ate at good restaurants. But it was just one of those times where you're kind of, when you think back on it, and in some way it's less than even what we're facing today, which is not just the potential political threat today being, 2024. People who watch this in the year 3000, but but today the threat is not just the political or the federal funding, it's the technology and the disaggregation of audiences. So in some way, the threat today, I think, is worse, but back then it was, it just felt very much right in front of our faces. And
well, it did. What was the plan for the glide path to zero? What was public television, public radio? What was going to happen if we would have gone to zero? What was the plan?
I don't know that I read the final report, but I think it might have been Doug's last day. I do not remember either. There were certainly the obvious things about the winnowing down, the larger stations becoming the focal points, the much more trimmed down system. I think that would have been essentially what would have had to happen, but it wasn't as if there was some big resolution that was going to be taken to the CPB board, and as it turned out, the threat didn't materialize. I mean, it didn't actually happen. But I think that would have been.
Would KBDI have survived?
I don't know how, without the federal funding, survival and thriving, it would have been really a challenge, very, very definite challenge. Look at, we had a small budget that grew some, but it's still, 2-3 million a year. So I think it would have been a real challenge. But it would have been a challenge for all the small stations. It wouldn't just been it wasn't an overlap problem. I mean, small TV, I think radio has, because they get less money from CPB, probably have been in a better position. But if you look at, I don't know how many, 100 small stations, 5 million and below, unless they're I think institutional licensees, state licensees have that alternate support, but stations in smaller communities or stations as the secondary station without federal funding would be a major challenge to survive. And I guess, the question is survival. I was thinking, there's one thing to survive, there's one thing to have some kind of a dynamic presence in your community. And if you can't, one of the most expensive, least revenues generating is the local, doing production. That takes manpower and it takes kind of an energy. And a lot of times those programs are not necessarily the ones that generate support. Sometimes you have grant support and so it's not always the case. But small stations, yeah, that would be the problem, and defining survival.
Would smaller stations survive a defunding of CPB at this point? or would it be somewhat of the same situation?
Oh, we can get into this more when we get into CPB, but uh, I think it's a multiple threat right now, just to put it out there. And I think that it's going to get worse. It's there was a slide that actually we took from, I think, a PBS slide that showed the broadcast audience shrinking to basically within 5 years being almost negligible. And that right now the primary broadcast audience is 60, 65 plus that is watching public television, and that will continue to shrink. So this is with the funding. So then the question is, where is that audience going and how do you reach them? So you've got audiences that are, streaming, much rise in streaming. You've got all these different places, smartphones and all of this. And I don't think there's been anything, unless I've missed it, that has risen to a level that is going to compensate for that, the loss of the broadcast audience. So there is a change in the business model that is inevitable regardless of the federal funding. And the question is, what will that look like? I mean, radio has a similar challenge, but it's a little better positioned for it. But I don't know on the TV side. I mean, I did recently lead a few meetings just around this issue, and I can't say I came away from it more optimistic. A lot of smart people thinking about this, but it's not an easy answer. So, and if the federal funding went away, that would just exacerbate it. No, I don't think. If I were to take that guy, remember I talked about the nuclear war guy?
Yes, yes.
There's a scenario without going back to the 1800s. Where public media would go back to like very humble roots, it wouldn't have a lot of money. It'd be very community based. It would be somewhat like I listened to KGNU radio in Boulder and somewhere, but it'd be very cool station to listen to. But it would not have anything like the presence of, it would not have the large visibility. It would be a much smaller funded entity, more community based and kind of more genuine in a sense, but not a major player in that way.
So, Ted, do you play golf?
I did when I was a Buddhist. I had more time.
Really? Well, I want to go back to a quote that you had. I think it was around the time of Tongues Untied. It was something to the extent that you told viewers that you were seeking to put more grit in public television and take it out of the country club set.
I grew up with a country club. Well, I think we did that to some degree at the KBDI.
It took chances. You were willing to irritate, and you were successful from the time when you became the manager, and there was the talk about bankruptcy. When you did end up leaving, you had quite a bit of money in the bank for KBDI, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't, it's all relative. It wasn't a lot of money. It was like $1 million in the bank, but that's better than worrying about bankruptcy. And we had I think, a model that was working. I think the challenge was how much it could grow from that. But it was, yeah, I think I felt overall and going through this exercise and thinking back that we did a lot of really interesting stuff, and some of it I think infused energy into public media, and so I feel good about that. Yeah, so I actually, in terms of my general career, it's one that you could easily make a film about. It might be a comedy, but you could make a lot of stuff happen. A lot of stuff happened, and we
Well,
only talk.
time has a way of. Go ahead.
I was saying, well, I'm talking about the stuff that's suitable for being watched, but yes, very
Time
compelling.
has a way of putting things into perspective. Kind of looking back at your KBDI years, um, what are your thoughts on that period now? And number two, what were the three biggest accomplishments that you felt you had during those years? So let's take them one at a time and just talk about the perspective that you have now looking back that maybe you didn't have when you were in the middle of those battles.
Three biggest. Boy, that's going to be hard to do off the top of my head. But I think the obvious one is that we've figured out a way to make it work. So when I think back and think about the way it started, or even the way I started, I was just kind of thrown into whether it's what the hell is an auction, or to how do we survive. And so I think the fact that we somehow pulled it together is something that I think I personally have some pride in, and I feel was pretty pretty remarkable given everything that we were facing at the time, and that we did it in a way. And this is when I went back and researched it, and I looked at the different articles and things about, it's one thing to call yourself First Amendment. It's another thing to have other people recognizing that and commenting on it. And so when I was kind of researching this and just seeing that we actually did carve out a niche that time, I think was important. And I feel very good about that. That's one.
Yeah, so you carved out a niche, and you and the station survived, and and is doing remarkably well by the time you leave.
Yeah, I mean it's on stable footings. I can't speak for it since then. I actually, when I moved on, but it's still there, and it still seems to be, doing well. Um, so yeah, I feel good about that. I think when I think about my life, and I kind of written some about it, but my kind of own personal journey, it's been an interesting, I've very rarely have been bored in my life. I mean, the KBDI was not boring. You know, Penn State was not boring. CPB, as you know, was many things, but not boring. So it's been challenging. And if I mentioned the psychoanalyst that said it's good when I'm irritated or challenged, I
Yes.
think for somebody who was kind of wandered around the country and to have kind of found something and stayed with it in a way, I feel pretty good about looking back on it.
So let me take you back in time then to the moment that you saw that ad in the paper in Boulder for the volunteer coordinator at KBDI. What was your mindset then? Was that something like, this is just another interview like, famous footwear or Ball Brothers? Or did you have a hunch that, maybe there was something here that would really fit with your skill set? Or was it just, I need a job?
It was not, I just need a job. It definitely was not that. It was finally something that appealed. And to be honest, I knew nothing about Fremco, so this was just in my head about public media. That's something I could get into. It's something that I actually support and believe in as a concept. And so, I don't believe in famous shoes or whatever, and I don't, I don't, whatever Ball Brothers does, more power to them. But it was something that I had a connection to. So I had no idea what the reality would be, but it was an interest. It's like piqued my interest. It's like I actually cared about the product. So it was a total act of faith, or that there was something there. And but that's what initially led me. It piqued my interest, I guess, which and then which turned out to be a career. But I
Yeah,
never,
and a really good career.
yeah, it has made
Ted,
me, yeah.
you go ahead.
No, I was saying it has forced me to do things to grow in different ways. I think that has been on the one hand, I'm happy now to be in a place where I'm looking back on things, but it did kind of push me into arenas that brought out, strengths of mine and probably also weaknesses at different points, but it really put me in the middle of a lot of things that I guess what's that cliche about being in the arena, that you're kind of in the middle of things, and I think I enjoyed that. Um,
So from doing the research on it that I did, from talking with you and so forth, it seems like you made all of the right moves. But is there something that you would have done differently?
uh, I think probably talking to somebody who worked a lot in institutional licenses, I probably would have gone to a larger community station, not to an institution. And there are a lot of
Mhm.
things that I liked at Penn State, so I don't want to but I have real concerns about the kind of editorial freedom of institutional licensees. And I think, so I think I learned a lot and I don't regret it at all. But I think probably, given all that, if I went back, I'd say, well, I actually had skill sets to go, I could have talked to Ron Bornstein a little more about look over here a little bit more. And so I think that would be maybe one area that I might do differently. I think also, if I were to go back, knowing everything I know, I would do a lot of things I did just differently. I'm more sophisticated. I know a lot more stuff about the industry, and but part of the fun was, or part of the intrigue was figuring it out. So I think that kind of developing that ability. So I never felt like I couldn't deal with something. So just, I think developing that confidence. Um, so that often comes, I kind of joked, I don't know if I ever joked with you about it, that if I wrote a memoir, I think I would call it My Greatest Failures, because a lot of the things that I really, very ambitious, it didn't work. I learned a tremendous amount about, and that, I could name them, but just things that, and you saw them at CBB or they were at Penn State, just taking on these things that in hindsight, I say, well, maybe I shouldn't have done them, but they were, I actually look back on them and kind of appreciate them. So I didn't make KBDI a major success. I didn't make it like WNET or something. And there's limits to what it could have done. But part of the whole interest was, how do you make it work? And that's where I think the satisfaction came from. I want to get overly
And it did work. It
yeah.
did work. It survives. It survives today. And as I mentioned, it was in really good shape when you left. Another segment of this will be your move to Penn State, and then to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And so we'll deal with those issues in the future. But in relationship to just this part of the segment, any other comments?
I think you have done a remarkably thorough job of making sure we went through all those. I mean, I think we've covered, there are a few things that are But I think we get a sense of it, and I appreciate you leading me through this and making me think about it. Um,
Oh, happy to do so. It's public media is a fascinating journey. Each station has a unique story, but given the fact that the beginnings of KBDI, humble beginning and a success. I think that it really has had a positive impact on the public television and public media service. And a tip of the hat to you for your major role in that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.